All right, let's get started this evening. Welcome to the LaRouche PAC weekly discussion. Got a bit of a change of lineup here tonight. Add some new voices to the discussion. So as you know, I'm Mike Stager. I'll be the host tonight, moderator. And we've got a special guest leading the discussion, taking your questions, which is kind of one of our leading organizers for many, many years, Susan Kokinda. She's been organizing out here in the Midwest area. I think most of you are very familiar with her. Let me just get into and premise the discussion tonight on some aspects that have developed over the last weekend, which are not insignificant. Now, as many of you know, and we haven't yet discussed this since last Monday, there was a major primaries in Arizona, Missouri, Michigan, Washington. The Washington one is still ongoing, where Joe Kent may pull out a major victory versus the establishment-backed Herrera Butler in the congressional district. They'll announce more votes sometime probably during this call. This is part of the dragging out of elections. It's likely he'll overturn and take the second position, Joe Kent will. But there were major victories in Arizona with Kari Lake for governor, Tudor Dixon in Michigan for governor, and a number of other candidates, all of which were Trump-endorsed. Tomorrow you will have Wisconsin, and the week after that you'll have Alaska, Wyoming, and Minnesota. And we had a Midwest call last Wednesday. One of our activists in Minnesota, Ted Kroll, mentioned you've got a great candidate there, Scott Jensen, Republican candidate for governor in Minnesota. He's already the Republican nominee, who is he's a medical doctor who's been I don't know, I guess served or put on notice, or his license has been checked or challenged by various medical boards because he refuses to stop prescribing ivermectin for COVID. Now, he took that as just a level of insanity, much like a lot of parents did with the CRT or transgender insanity, and he's fought back. But he was at an ag fair, the state ag fair in Minnesota last week, challenging the incumbent Tim Walz, and Dr. Scott Jensen said that farmers need to expand production to expand exports and their own profits and income. And the way they're going to do that is by increasing technology. Well, we haven't heard that kind of talk for a long time. And it's a direct echo of the kind of organizing the LaRouche organization, LaRouche operation, had been organizing in depth in places like Minnesota throughout the 70s and the 1980s regarding real industry and real agriculture as part of a national development program. And then in doing so, of course, setting a standard for what kind of development should take place around the world. Tim Walz's response to that, just to give a sense of the insanity of the Democratic Party and the lack of awareness of the actual conditions that most people are facing. Walt said, farmers are fine, we're doing great, they don't need anything. I mean, as blasé and out of touch as one can be. So besides the candidates that won, places like Arizona, Michigan, Minnesota, Trump held a rally over the weekend in Wisconsin for Tim Michels, who's the Republican candidate. He's in a primary tomorrow on Tuesday. He's a big infrastructure guy, does boring machines, these $40 million, huge 30-meter wide boring machines for huge tunnels, infrastructure projects. We're looking at major slates put together, not just candidates, but slates of candidates that have been organized and have come out of this grassroots army that it has developed really since the COVID lockdowns and the November 3rd, 2020 election, if you call it that. I think you all know what I mean. So, and so you're seeing a kind of a shift in the political dynamic of the country. Real candidates, we've got a few more primaries to go. Obviously, Liz Cheney in Wyoming. There's the big fight for senator up in Alaska against a big rhino up there. But every indication says that and you saw this in Arizona, which was a huge fight. Kari Lake was outspent 10-1, 30 million to 3 million. And yet she still prevailed, and she won every single county once they finally counted the votes, which took a little too long. That the mobilization, the commitment that Trump has taken, and his main commitment, and we stressed this over the last week of our discussions, and Trump did a special call last Monday night with Tudor Dixon on the eve of the Michigan primary. His emphasis was then, and will continue to be, it is the economy. How do you bring to bear a full scope development of our economy as rapidly as possible? And this is exactly what Kari Lake addressed. There was a CPAC conference in Dallas. And on Thursday through Sunday, Kari Lake spoke and she said, look, we need to bring in independent voters. We need to bring in the disoriented, the disillusioned Democratic voters who realize the Democratic Party has gone insane. It's not gone left. It's gone psychotic. It's gone authoritarian. It's gone massively oppressive. It's gone totalitarian on green doctrines. Susan may touch tonight on these insane bills, but I think she's going to get a bit deeper. But we've seen these bills pass. This is hyperinflationary. It's to shut down and it's hyperinflationary not simply because it's just printing money, but it's actually shutting down investments into anything actually productive, going towards green energy insanity. But another speech at the CPAC was noteworthy, and it's posted on our website, and I will actually put this in the chat box now. Oh, that's not it. I'll post it in just a second. So the other speech, which is highlighted on our website, was actually given by Steve Bannon. Now, if you follow our stuff, you know Steve Bannon has not been someone that we generally support. He was someone who seemed to be playing a lot of dirty games with people like Don Jr., Roger Stone. He was kicked out of the administration within a year for shenanigans, and comes out of this Mercer crowd, was backing Ted Cruz, none of which really looked promising. I say that because in some ways, you know, the way this historical process works is not what you expect. He addressed a speech which took up a number of the key facets that we have been focusing on now for months. And most specifically, in his speech, at the end, he calls for not just auditing the Fed, but ending the Fed. Now, people in Texas will know, others of you that may know the Libertarian or Ron Paul operation, you know, ending the Fed is not a new slogan. But Steve Bannon goes further. He didn't just say end the Fed. He went through how the entire 19th century was a fight over what direction what determines our currency. He doesn't reference national bank. He doesn't have the courage to mention those words or the wherewithal, whatever it is, but he didn't mention them. But he does say that it was a fight throughout the entire 19th century until they basically imposed the Federal Reserve on us as a Wall Street globalist program. And he references people like Hamilton, Jackson, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. And he recognizes that there is a broad fight, and he goes directly, and this is a conservative crowd, he goes directly at Wall Street. He even praises Franklin Roosevelt, which to this crowd is something that's not been developed. This is not within the purview of a CPAC crowd. This is, you know, Reagan, you know, I mean, that's about it. I mean, those are the references. There aren't a lot of historical points, but FDR is certainly not one of them. And the reason I'm raising this is because, and I guess the spear point of it was he said, we need to end the Fed, and we need, I don't know what he calls it, a central bank, but a bank that's owned by the American people. Now that is what a national bank is. That gets at the essence of a globalist operation of central banking versus a nationalist American system program of banking, credit, and development to rebuild the country. And so it gives a sense that not just that Steve Bannon is probably watching LaRouche PAC's site to some level, but that other people are, and the pressure is growing, not because of the policy. We've been we're such a major operation. We've got so many people out there pushing national banking, though many of you are doing that, and that's having a major impact. But because the nature of the historical process is developing in such a way that these ideas are just starting to make sense. And I think it's really on that note that Susan wants to address tonight. So I'm going to leave my remarks there, hand it over to her, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Good to be here. I think the theme of what I'm going to talk about tonight is that we've entered into a new political space, or as our founder Lyndon LaRouche would have described it, a phase space. It's one which is increasingly dominated by principles, not by practicality, not by, the same old way of doing things. I want to start by just looking back at an article, a post we put on our website about 2 weeks ago by our colleague Tony Pappert, which was entitled, "The Trump of 2016 is Back, Smarter and Tougher." And if you think about what it means to talk about the Trump of 2016, I mean, first of all, here you had the ultimate outsider who came in. But what the two main points that dominated his presidential campaign, and which obviously resonated deeply with the American population in such a way that he shocked the Democratic Party, their Wall Street controllers, and the globalists that controlled them, to the point of the kind of hysteria we've lived through in the last 6 years. But the two main points that he stressed were the economy, constantly addressing the need to bring our manufacturing back, to protect our workers, to build our energy independence, to develop infrastructure. And the other main theme, which is always a complete threat to the control of this global imperial oligarchy, was his desire to end the endless wars and to work out peaceful relations with other nations, whether they were our close friends or not. The fact that he got elected on the basis of those policies sent the oligarchy into a complete frenzy. And we've lived through the consequences of that over the course of the past 6 years. We've lived through Russiagate, the impeachments, the pandemic, what happened in the elections, the January 6th false flag operation, which is still playing out to this day, unprecedented levels of censorship now being imposed on the American people. And what that has done, I think, over the past 6 years is it's forced not just President Trump and his allies, his small group of allies, I might say, when he was president, but also the American people into the politics of reaction that is reacting to these unbelievable assaults that have been thrown against us as a people, as a nation, as a president over the course of the past 6 years. Now, there's two ways to fight when you're in that kind of combat situation. One is you can just shoot back at the guys who are directly in front of you, which you do have to do if they're shooting at you, because otherwise you're not going to be around to do much of anything else. But if you fight that same fight, but instead with a knowledge of the larger strategy based on why we fight, as was the title of that famous series of films that mobilized the American people in World War II by Frank Capra. When you fight from the standpoint of what's at stake, which I think many Americans have done over the past 6 years, but when you do it by looking at the entire field of battle and where you stand in history, you fight in a different kind of way. And it's I think from that standpoint that we have brought into the fight that quality of where we are in history, what is the entire field of battle, that you can look at the political victories and the very singular speeches, which Mike has already referenced. You can look at them as the manifestation of the growing success of that method of fighting. Mr. LaRouche identified it in a historical context. It's actually a German term called Auftragstaktik, which means mission tactic. And the Germans of the late 19th century and the early 20th century really had superior soldiers because of this, because down to the level of the officer leading a small group, or maybe even the non-com officer leading a small group, they were trained in the larger question of what is the overall mission, not just what are the immediate tactics in front of us, but the tactics driven from the standpoint of the mission. And again, I think it's because we have brought into the fight that quality that you can look at these rather singular developments over the past week. I want to revisit Steve Bannon's speech, because I think it really does reflect understanding where it comes from and how you should be thinking about his speech and your relationship to the things which he brought up in that speech. Is really a window on this larger picture that I'm trying to develop. And, I will say, like Mike had said, it's not a question of Steve Bannon. You don't approach this from the standpoint of a rating system. Well, he said 3 things that are right and 2 things that are wrong. So the 2 things that are wrong nullify the 3 things that are right, and you have some kind of stupid political calculus. But rather that this speech is the reflection of this dynamic where principles are indeed beginning to triumph over what people think are practical politics. So yes, I mean, among the things that he identified in his speech was this question of the Federal Reserve, as Mike developed, and this assertion that you have to have an institution which is owned by the people, and that we have to own our currency. He attacked BlackRock by name. He attacked Wall Street by name. He identified the huge discrepancies in wealth, which have evolved in the American people over the past 10, 15, 20, 30 years because of Wall Street's policies. He attacked the authoritarian state, identifying it as composed of the authoritarian state, big tech, big pharma, big media. And then, of course, he has to throw in the question of China, which is really not the dominating factor in this. But this question of the authoritarian state, he came back to time and time again. He attacked the 4th branch of government, in other words, the administrative Leviathan. And he made very passionately clear that we are at war, and it is a question of defending our constitutional republic. Now, you could wait for Bannon's August 5th speech last Friday to be mobilized on these questions. Or if you've been in touch with us and working with us, as many of you on this call have, you've already been on the battlefield in all of these fights. Last February, Mike and his usual co-host, Keisha Rogers, were down in Orlando, Florida, and went to the previous CPAC conference down there. And began circulating, especially among the younger attendees at that CPAC conference, this question of getting rid of the Federal Reserve, replacing it with a national bank, and addressing the questions of the economy, even though most of these speeches coming from the podium of that particular conference were just jingoism, warmongering, and the things that you used to expect from the CPAC conference. We here in Michigan, when President Trump came to hold a rally in April of this year, were out there with a leaflet calling for abolishing the Federal Reserve. And we were just struck by the depth of response. Again, from the world of practicality, people will say to you, well, this happened here, because my husband just finished a state representative campaign where he lost by 62 votes. But the main theme of his campaign was the fight between central banking and national banking. And wise political figures kept coming up to us and saying, nobody is going to understand what you're talking about. And we found instead that the blue collar workers here in his district were totally resonant with the idea that you weren't going to fix our productive economy until you fixed things structurally, and that meant shutting down the Federal Reserve. And we began to sense that when we organized amongst the 10,000 plus people who were at the Trump rally in Michigan back in April. Then right in Texas, where the CPAC conference took place, our Texas organizers in June did bring the fight to replace the Federal Reserve with a national bank to the Texas Republican Party. And they did adopt, officially as a plank, the part about abolishing the Fed. The Jeffersonians amongst them and the Wall Streeters amongst them cut out the part about replacing it with a national bank. But nonetheless, that was a very dominant part of the discussion right there in Texas at the Texas State Convention just 2 months before this CPAC conference. You look at what Bannon said about the disparity in income. You can go back, scroll through our website, read some of Bob Ingram and Brian Lance's articles about what the Federal Reserve has done in terms of a massive transfer of wealth. And it's all right there. Just a week or so ago, we posted on our website a really great article on how Trump intends, as Bannon said, to go back in and clean out the fourth branch of government, the bureaucracy, by taking on the civil service questions. And then you look at what Bannon said about the authoritarian state. Many of you remember back over a year ago, not too far into the Biden collective's occupation of the White House, we put out a charming picture of Mussolini Joe has to go, a picture of Joe Biden in a Mussolini uniform, but very much from the standpoint of getting people to understand that the enemy was not communism or socialism in some kind of simple-minded way, but as Bannon actually went after, a marriage of an authoritarian state with big tech, with big pharma, with Wall Street. So again, many of you have already been on this battlefield with us and helped shape an environment in which these are things which are now being brought forward, probably, to see, I mean, the Bannon speech may very well be, how are people going to react to this? And we already know the answer to that. People are ready to go. They are ready for this level of fight. Now, I think we're at this point because we are at such an extreme level of crisis. As bad as the economic situation in our country has been since Biden occupied the White House, the legislation which has just been passed, the so-called CHIPS bill, and now the Manchin-Schumer bill, which my friend Brian Lance discussed in detail last Saturday night in our Saturday night class series, a bill which he appropriately renamed, I think, the Charlie Manson bill, for the effect that it's going to have on our economy. This will obliterate the very last ability of the United States to continue to function as any kind of modern agro-industrial economy if it is not reversed, which is obviously the political battle before us as we go into the 2022 midterm elections and on to 2024. But I think it is because of the intensity of the economic crisis that we are able to tap in to something very, very deep in the American people, which is resonating. And I was looking at a short document written a long time ago, 1978, by 78 or 79 by Lyndon LaRouche, where he talks about the necessary kind of political transformation, which would be commensurate with saving our economy. And he makes the following point. He says, it is only during periods of crisis, such as wars or a wrecking of the previously established institutions of domestic peace and relative prosperity, that the potential exists for actually mobilizing the majority of a great people to do a great thing. In other words, he knew that in times of relative normalcy, relative prosperity, most people would not be mobilized. And he organized, he devoted himself, and we devoted the focus of our organizing over the decades to the recognition that we knew that such a time would come when people were actually mobilized, when a great people could be mobilized to do a great thing. He knew that because when he said this nearly 50 years ago, or if you go back 51 years ago, to the breaking point really in the post-war period, which was the August 15th ending of the Bretton Woods system, when we took the first step in handing our economic sovereignty over to the global financial elite by decoupling the dollar from the gold standard. LaRouche knew that at that point we would be on a pathway, that this represented a failed set of axioms, a destructive set of axioms, or I hate to say failed, because the people who have imposed these insane globalist policies, these anti-sovereignty policies over the past 51 years, they were succeeding in their intention, which was to destroy the United States. But what LaRouche knew is that embedded in that destruction was the fact that people would see ultimately that this was a failure. And we've seen that. What the enemy is always counted on is, as they impose these policies and it causes a weakening of the economy, people begin to see it and react against it. Their intention is to slap down that resistance, silence anybody who might fight it, terrorize the population, and keep going. Well, they haven't really been able to do that. They certainly tried to do that in the person of Lyndon LaRouche when he was framed up by Robert Mueller back in 1988 and tossed in the Huskow for 5 years to try and terrify people who were resisting and exposing these policies. And unfortunately, all too many people did capitulate at that point, but enough didn't, and kept the fighting spirit alive. And along came Donald Trump in 2016. Now, the intimidation tactics they tried to carry out against the American population and against political leaders in the years subsequent to Trump, they pale in comparison to what's happened over the course of the past 60 years. I mean, you've seen a fascist assault, in a sense, on steroids against Trump, against his movement, but it has failed because the American people, at least the America First movement, the MAGA movement, has stood on its feet and constantly fought back. And I think you can see that embodied very much in the question of Kari Lake. And if you look at her speech at the CPAC conference, it has this quality of courage that nothing is going to back her down from doing what she thinks is her moral mission for the future. And of course, that's what Donald Trump represents in an extraordinary way at this particular moment in history. And this is why I say I think we're in a new phase space. That is, we're now at the point where we're consciously transitioning from the politics of reaction to going on the offensive. to taking the fight to the enemy. And that very much is the question of picking up on the question of the economy, as Mike referenced in his introduction. I've been struck over the course of the past week and a half by how much the question of the economy is becoming the lunge in terms of Trump's speeches, in terms of the political shape of things. And Trump himself, of course, his speech at the CPAC conference started with the questions of industry, energy, inflation, what's happening to our economy. The first words out of his mouth before he got to some of the other, very, very volatile, politically emotional issues. I want to look briefly at the situation, how the political fight is unfolding in Michigan, because I think it gives a certain window on a larger historic political process. One which, again, Lyndon LaRouche saw way back in that 1978 speech, which I'll come back to. But as people probably are aware, at the very last minute, Trump came in and endorsed one of the 5 gubernatorial candidates here in Michigan, a conservative businesswoman named Tudor Dixon. And that pretty much gave her the boost over 4 other conservative candidates. It was a very kind of surreal situation here in Michigan, because right up to 2-3 weeks before the election, 50% of Republicans had not decided who to vote for governor. I mean, I was in somebody's office on Friday before the election, and he said to me, "Susan, all my clients are asking me, who should I vote for governor? I haven't decided." So it was for a variety of reasons that we've written about, there was no clear front runner. Trump made his decision, contrary to what a lot of uninformed people here in Michigan are saying, who are claiming that, somebody slipped him a piece of paper and he didn't know what he was doing. Trump clearly knew what he was doing in endorsing Tudor Dixon. You could see that in the CPAC conference when he referenced her and talked about the fact that her father, who passed away, I think, less than a month ago, ran a manufacturing company. Trump knew him. He said he understood manufacturing. He understood the questions of free trade, the questions of how free trade was hurting us. So again, contrary to people who really don't know what they're talking about, he did know what he was doing. And on Monday, the Monday before the election, he did a teleconference with Tudor that anybody could listen in on. So I listened in. And again, it was the same point. He just lunged on the question of the economy. She will fight for Michigan workers. She will fight for Michigan manufacturing. She will fight for Michigan energy. And again, made this very, very clear. So his endorsement really did, I think, obviously tip the tide. She won fairly handily in terms of this broad array of conservative candidates. But, and so this question of American workers, American manufacturing, I think will emerge, if it emerges as the central theme of the political fight in Michigan, we will be able to turn this state red. But there's another process going on. And again, it points to this larger political transformation, which I think is going on. And that is what is happening with the representation of the African-American population here in Michigan. For the first time in over 50 years, I believe, but decades and decades and decades, there will not be a Black Democratic congressman from the state of Michigan. Now, people may remember we had John Conyers, who really was a champion on many, many fronts, against war, against fascism, for American workers, and so on. Sort of exemplary of the kind of figures that used to represent the Black population in Michigan. Because of redistricting and a variety of other things, well, because of redistricting, the incumbent Black Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence chose not to run. And because of certain musical chairs in terms of the districts, the District 13, which I happen to live in, which covers the vast majority of the city of Detroit, suddenly had no incumbent. So you had a race, because you had a no incumbent, it's like a feeding frenzy. Everybody runs. I think there may have been 13 candidates on the ballot. But among the top, I would say 5 or 6 candidates, you had one self-made millionaire Indian named Sri Thanadar, and 4 African-American candidates representing, the typical Democratic Black machine in the area. And the millionaire managed to spend $5 million of his own campaign and won, which wiped out the Black representation for the people of the city of Detroit. For a variety of other reasons, their representation in the state legislature has also fallen sharply. But the really interesting thing about this entire process is, while there are no Black congressional candidates in the state of Michigan, there are 3 Black Republican candidates in Michigan. Perhaps the 2 most well-known are John Gibbs, who Trump endorsed, and who defeated the impeachment Republican Peter Meyer out in the western part of the state. The second one is fairly well-known nationally, John James. He ran 2 extraordinary campaigns for US Senate in the 2 previous rounds, clearly won the second one, in my opinion, but not according to the voting machines. So he ran again and ran for Congress and won. But, and the establishment press here is taking some note of that. What they're taking no note of whatsoever is that the Republican candidate for Congress in this 13th congressional district, which covers Detroit, is a young African-American who is very committed to the idea of turning the Republican Party back into the party of Lincoln. I'm not suggesting that it would be in any way easy for him to win in this particular election, but he represents an outlook. He represents the potential for transforming the Republican Party back in to the party of Abraham Lincoln, a party of workers, a party of producers, a party representing the various minorities in the United States, a party of patriots. And we're not the only people who've noticed this. There was an interview last week by Charlie Kirk of Turning Point. He interviewed Tudor Dixon a couple of days after she won. And he noted this, he called it the very unusual political circumstances in Wayne County, which is where Detroit is. And he made the point that you've got blue collar workers increasingly voting for Trump, yet the Democratic Party seems to still have a stranglehold at the lower levels of things. And asked Tudor Dixon what her thoughts were on that, which weren't all that inspiring. I thought what was interesting is that Kirk himself recognized the potential of this transformation, because I think what we're seeing as the discussion shifts from politics as usual, practicalities, as these larger historical forces come to play in this fight, that this has been a fight for thousands of years by an imperial elite arrayed against those who would organize society to uplift mankind, to engage in a constant process of improving society, of creating a better future, that we're beginning to see much more consciously and clearly how this process is playing itself out inside the United States. And I want to go back to that document, which Mr. LaRouche, which I referenced at the beginning, going back to 1978. I didn't tell you what the name of it was, back in it might have been 79, but at the end of the 1970s, as we were looking at the destruction of the Carter years, although compared to what we're going through today, Jimmy Carter looks like, a perfectly competent president. But he called this creating, the article was called Creating a Republican Labor Party. And he says something really quite stunning at the outset. He says, the Republican Party, now these are with a small r and a small p, he says the Republican Party is thousands of years old. It is traced in terms of formal historical knowledge available to us today in the writings of Plato and Plato's Academy at Athens, to Alexander the Great's city building policies, and he said the Neoplatonic or Republican tradition is the kernel of what we otherwise identify as the Judeo-Christian Islamic heritage. And then he references, he's referencing in a sense the philosophical and religious side of it. And he says, on the secular side, the center of Republican policy down through the millennia has been an emphasis on scientific and technological progress in the advance of the mode of production and material life in urban-centered civilization. And if you look at the emergence of our republic, if you look at the great figures like Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln, who carried that very, very conscious understanding forward, that the secular side of Republican policy has been the emphasis on scientific and technological progress, which to Mr. LaRouche was the essence, was the actual metric of economic policy. Not money, not anything else, nothing other than man's ability to improve his relationship to nature through scientific and technological progress. And I think what we're seeing in the way the political process, the dialogue has emerged over the course really of the last year and a half. I mean, since the events of November 2020 and January 2021, we've been very conscious of trying to guide an American people who are going through a crisis, properly going through a crisis because of what has happened to our nation, to guide them to this deeper understanding of what the nature of the battle is really all about, and to equip them and provide them with the policies where we begin to go on the offensive, as opposed to constantly just reacting. Those policies are very much led by precisely our fight to restore our economic sovereignty by ending the central bank control over our economy, and making these questions of scientific and technological progress, of rebuilding exactly the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, with workers, with patriots, with minorities, with builders, with the class of producers, or people who would like to be producers if they had half a chance in this economy, to rebuild that as the driving force in the nation. And I think what we've seen unfolding, both with the primary victories and the quality of people who have won and how they've won, and the changing nature of the discussion in the debate, really gives us a clear pathway between now and November and 2024 to indeed rescue our republic. So I'll leave my remarks there because I really would like to hear what people have to say.